In this lesson, we'll learn a little bit about the process of painting our textures in a Ptex project instead of a UV-based project. Alright, so I have the lesson 05_begin Mari archive open here. If you want to check out your project files for this course, you'll find that in the Mari files folder here. So essentially what I've got here is for the different objects, we've got the eyes, the head, the hood, and the horns of our character here. And I've gone ahead and created some diffuse information for them. Now, if you explore this archive, you'll find that each one of those objects has only one channel. It's got a Ptex channel with that diffuse information on it here. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit in this lesson about just kind of how we paint textures on our Ptex files as opposed to a UV-based file. So really overall the process is going to be no different. We're going to paint texture on channels, and we're going to pipe those channels into our shader over here in the shaders palette. So very similar process to using UVs. Now we already mentioned in this course that the UV and the ortho/UV views, they're not available for Ptex files, so we'll either need to paint in the ortho or the perspective view. And there are actually a few very small other differences, just mainly features that are not available here inside of a Ptex project. So now the first thing that you should know is that if we were to right-click here in our area of our work area here, you're going to notice that patch mode has been disabled. Obviously we don't have UV patches, so we don't need patch mode. The only things we have are face mode and object mode. And Mari's going to try and default to face mode for us. So if I were to come in here and hold down the S key on my keyboard, you can see here that we're in face mode. So I can make selections on my horns object by holding down the S key, and I'm making face selections here. Now, if I wanted to, I could always come over here and select the Object Mode button, and we could select the entire object, but that, again, is not the default. By default, if we were to come up here and select the eyes, Mari's going to default over to Face Mode. Now, some other features that I've noticed that are not available to us here in a Ptex file, if we jump over here to our Channels palette, you'll notice here that the snapshot buttons are unavailable, so we can't click on any of those. Those are not going to be available to you in a Ptex project. In addition to the snapshot features, if we jump over to our shaders palette, and let me just select the gargoyle shader, and I'll go ahead and add a new shader module here. You may notice that there are some missing shader modules, one of which is the displacement shader module. It's not available in a Ptex project either. So again, a few minor features are not available to you with Ptex projects right now, but for the most part, the process of painting your textures in Ptex is exactly the same as it would be if you were painting those textures on a UV-based project. So let's go ahead and zoom in on her face here, and I'll go ahead and grab the head diffuse object here. You can see I've got some base diffuse textures again painted here, but depending on how close we're wanting to zoom in on this model for our renders, we may need to get even more detailed than I've gotten here already with our textures. We may need to begin creating things like the freckles, pores in the skin, cracks in the lips, a variety of different types of things that you would see zoomed in on a real person at this magnification. So, when this project was created, remember, we used a world space texel density of 16 texels. And I'll just set that back to 16 here. 16 texels was used for this entire project. So, and you can see here that painting at 16 texels, we've got kind of some resolution issues when it comes down to some of these smaller features. Things like the makeup around the eyes, as well as the actual faces that make up the eyeballs themselves. You can see the colors here that I've used to paint the eyeballs are kind of this burgundy color and this white color, and excuse me, I used a very soft brush when I painted those two colors. Now, because of that resolution limitation here, we have sort of this almost crystallized look going on in the eyes. And if that's something you're going for, then that'd be fine. But if you wanted more of a clean, smooth gradient here, then we need to jump over here to our eyes object. Let me just select the entirety of the eyes here. And we either need to increase the texel density for the selected faces, or we need to change the amount of texels per face here. So if you remember in a previous lesson, we actually increased that to 128, but we could do either one of those here for the eye objects. And let me just go ahead and show you here. I'll just go ahead and bump the texel density up to, let's just bump it up to something like 32 here, and I'll apply that to the selected faces. Now again, the paint that has already been laid down here is not affected. It's not resampled up to this higher resolution. But if we were to come in and begin to paint on these areas, say on the eyes for example, we'll just make sure that we're on the right channel here, and reach over and grab maybe a super soft brush of some kind. And let's see here. Let me go ahead and jump in here and sample some of these colors. See if we can't grab one of these burgundy colors here. And we'll sample that white color in the center. If we want to, we can always come in here and hide things. Alright, there we go. So we'll just come in here and begin to paint on the eye. And now you can see here that we're getting a much softer, smoother diffuse color that's coming in on our eye. So if I were to bake this down at this point, you can see here we have that nice smooth gradient, as opposed to the kind of this crystallized look that we had before. And again, that's just something that you need to be aware of when you're painting your textures here in a Ptex project, is that the resolution of the faces that you're painting on needs to be high enough to basically capture the details that you're wanting to capture here. So if we painted something like that, you can see here we've already started to kind of soften up those crystallized features there, those crystallized colors. So you come in here and we could paint this as much as we want to, but you know, again, this course is really not focused on the aspect of painting in Ptex. I'm just trying to show you kind of some ways that you can paint your textures in Ptex and consider the resolution of the surfaces at the same time here. So if we were to come in and look at maybe the lips, for example, again, we already looked at increasing the texel density for selected faces. We can also come in here and let's just grab our head diffuse object, and let's go ahead and just use our selection tool to maybe grab this mouth, sort of like so. Now again, we could always come in here and for the selected faces, we could increase the number of texels per face. Again, default is 1 texel per face, and we're getting this kind of look right now with that default setting. In the last lesson we learned we can actually make that change in our preferences, and we can set that up to a higher resolution, but here we can go ahead and manually set that up to a maximum of 8K per face. So obviously, I'm not going to need that amount of resolution per face, and that would make my textures very, very large. So you want to be careful, again, and only increase the resolution to levels that you actually need to capture the detail you're trying to get. So maybe if we came up and set this one to something like, let's just say 128, and applied that. Mario, go ahead and think about that here. And again, you're going to see some of these artifacts around the edges of the faces here. But that's something that, again, should not show up in your renders. We'll talk about exporting out our textures here in an upcoming lesson. But at this point, we could come in and let me just go ahead and sample some of these colors here. Maybe grab a different brush. You come in and you can already see how much more crisp the edges of my strokes are now that we have increased the resolution of those faces. So again, just another example of an area where we might want to capture more detail in our textures than was initially allowed by the resolution that we set up when we first created our project here. So again, I'm not going to paint these entire lips here, but now with this particular resolution, we can actually come in and begin to maybe paint in some of these cracks and crevices in between kind of these indentations in the lips here. So feel free to experiment with that, add some additional detail to our character's face here. If you want to practice maybe getting used to setting the resolution for a certain area based on the detail you want to capture, when you're done, go ahead and move on to the next lesson where we'll pick up where we're leaving off here, and we'll learn about exporting out our textures here in Mari.